Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of our Conversations with Authors program called Race in America. It's an annual event since 2019. We do this in honor of and in conjunction with Black History Month, recognizing the importance of uplifting diverse voices and stories. Each conversation covers a wide range of vital issues regarding race, racism, immigration, and exploring possible solutions featuring BIPOC authors and agents of change. And for this, our closing night of the series, I'm so very excited for our speakers. But before I get to their introductions, I just want to remind our audience, we want you to actively participate by putting in your comments and your questions in the chat section. And just a reminder that if you're not subscribed to Book Passage's YouTube channel, you can do that. It takes just a second. And I'm sure you're going to want to buy the books involved in tonight's event. And you can also do that in the link below right on this YouTube channel. But for now, I'm so happy to introduce at first our featured author, Oindrila Mukherjee, and we are going to talk about her debut novel. It's written from the perspectives of 10 different characters, and the book is called The Dream Builders. It's an incisive novel, explores class, divisions, gender roles, and stories of survival within a society that is constantly changing and becoming increasingly Americanized. It's a story about India today and people impacted by globalization everywhere, what it really costs, and to try to build a dream. Oindrila grew up in India, where she worked as a journalist for the country's oldest English language newspaper, The Statesman. She has attended university on 3 continents and now lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There, she teaches creative writing at Grand Valley State University. Her work has appeared in Salon, Los Angeles Review of Books, and many, many other outlets. The Dream Builders, as mentioned, is her glorious debut. Joining Oindrila and graciously agreeing to moderate tonight's discussion is friend of Book Passage and one of my favorite people in the world, Mei Chai. Mei is a writer and educator and the recipient of numerous awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association Literary Award, among many others. She is the author of 11 books, including 3 novels, 2 works of memoir, and the award-winning short story collection, Useful Phrases for Immigrants. Her latest book, Tomorrow in Shanghai, is a wonderful short story collection exploring cultural complexities in China, the Chinese diaspora in America, and the world at large. With that, I'm so happy to put it over into Mei Chai's capable hands. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Paula. It's always an honor to to be part of one of your amazing events, and especially the conversations on race for book passages. And especially, I'm thrilled to be talking with Oindrila Mukherjee. I read The Dream Builders, and it is an amazing book. It's kaleidoscopic, it's current, and what was particularly thrilling is that it defies all the usual stereotypes that we tend to see a lot of in the United States. So I was just wanting to start for readers and viewers who may not have had the chance yet to read The Dream Builders. Would you be willing to read a passage, a few pages?
Sure. Thank you, Maylee. I just want to start by saying thank you to Book Passage for inviting me and having me and for including me in this amazing series. And thank you to you. It's such an honor to speak with you. I love your work, and I really loved your latest book. Um, I think that since this is mostly for people who may not have read the book, I'll just read a little bit from the beginning. So the book does have 10 different perspectives, and each chapter is from a different perspective. So the first one is Maneka, and I don't need to explain much because it's the beginning. Maneka. The invitation arrived in her inbox just hours after her own arrival in Rishipur. She was lying in bed, bruised from the long flight and slightly stunned by this return to a country she no longer recognized, a home without her mother, and the prospect of an endless summer when the cell phone next to her lit up with the new text. As soon as she glanced at it and saw who it was from, Maneka knew she would accept. She would appear at this party even if her reasons were all wrong. She clutched the phone in a tight grip, afraid that if she let go, the text might disappear like many other things in her life. The glow of the screen was the only glimmer of light at the end of the long, dark tunnel she had inhabited these past few months. The damp and trembling cloud she had been living inside had solidified only a few hours ago with the proverbial return of the expatriate, the return they had always warned her would be the hardest. The moment of landing at Indira Gandhi International Airport earlier that night had been one of confusion when she couldn't quite tell if she was departing or arriving. The airport was nothing like the small, sedate one in Calcutta that she had used in the past. Inside the lounge, a bewildered Maneka had stared up at the wall where gleaming bronze hands twisted in various mudras of classical dance to welcome visitors to a land of ancient traditions. But just beyond the lobby, the luxurious duty-free shop made her feel like she was in an airport in another country, somewhere in the Western world, somewhere she was just passing through. She had lingered for a while among the bottles of scotch and cartons of expensive cigarettes before forcing herself to walk to the entrance and confront the sight of her father standing alone. His solitary figure looked unmoored without her mother's next to it. His hair had turned completely white since she had last seen him 6 years ago, and he had acquired rolls of fat everywhere, under his chin, around his waist, over his previously slim shoulders. Her once handsome, athletic father looked old, almost as if he was someone else's father. Her throat had ached as she tried to smile for him. 6 years was a long time to stay away from your country, long enough to lose one parent and become a stranger to the other. The familiar and unfamiliar had blended together as Maneka stepped out of the airport into the blast of dry, scalding air. What she had known all her life growing up was that heat, those chattering crowds, the cacophony of car horns, the sea of brown faces, the aunties in their salwar kameezes, and the scent of Old Spice on her father's body next to her. And then there was everything that had changed since the last time, since her parents had uprooted their lives and moved across the country to this new city just outside the capital, the city everyone in India talked about these days, the one she was about to finally discover for herself. When they were leaving the airport, she had craned her neck to look back at it, so she would remember this bittersweet homecoming for the essays she was supposed to write over the summer. What she saw was a billboard with a pertinent question. Trump has arrived, have you? The letters were scrawled across an outline of a building that stretched all the way to the top of the billboard, as if it were trying desperately to touch the sky. She had flown thousands of miles, but the shadow of America had nonetheless preceded her here. As their car sped along the broad expressway that led to Rishipur, Maneka had moved ahead from left to right as if she were at a tennis match. On either side, neon signs flashed the names of multinational corporations: Sony, Google, Microsoft, ESPN, Bank of America. Even in the dim light, she could discern the silhouettes of the buildings, glass and steel, rising like trees in a forest. Despite her grief at the gaping hole that was her mother's absence, Manika had also felt something else. A little stirring inside as if something dormant was finally awakening. The bright lights and clusters of tall buildings reminded her that this was life in a big city, life among people, her own people. Already, Heathersfield seemed very far away, and with it, Mike's face had begun to recede as well. I'll just stop there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. And that really sets the stage for your book. I wanted to ask you, because I think one of the things that's so brilliant about this book is how it brings in like current events and so many perspectives and defies stereotypes. Like here in San Francisco, where I am, we know about like India as center of tech, and we know about Indian tech workers. This is not about that India. Or also like, Hollywood loves exotic India, right? And, maybe some people know Bollywood India, but this is really globalized India. And in fact, one of the major plot points is there's a new development in this new city, and it's Trump Towers. A Trump Towers is going to be built, and we see how that figures into the plot. Would you mind talking a little bit about how you came up with that as an organizing principle? I just think it's really brilliant, eerie, prescient, just very interesting.
Thank you. It's interesting because at first, for a while, the Trump Towers thing didn't come to me until later. I was sort of trying to navigate this idea of a city that was known for its real estate constructions, and that just has had many, many, many buildings and luxury condos coming up. And that was inspired by a real city, although it's very exaggerated and, completely fictionalized. But this idea of a lot of buildings, a lot of development, a lot of real estate, malls and hotels and offices and residences. And then I actually realized that the real city that inspired this city, when I was visiting it every couple of years because my parents lived there, the constructions were stalling. The residences were actually, the high-rise communities were not always being built. People were investing in condos, but then either not getting the property or just very, very late or not getting what they had expected. And so it was kind of like a real estate dream gone bust, And I was trying to set a novel there, but I wasn't, I also really wanted an American angle just because I live here and I feel like that's something unique for me, my perspective. And just having Manika go from America to India felt a little tropey to me. I didn't want to just have that person returning and, the outsider. But then one day I was actually traveling from this city out on the outskirts of Delhi that inspired Rishipur to Delhi. And I saw the sign which said, "Trump has arrived, have you?" It was on a granite wall. I have a photo of that sign, and it was an advertisement for Trump Towers, even though it was not being built in that city. But I think there are several Trump Towers planned, or under construction in different cities. But it was the sign that really caught my attention. And I thought, well, that's just really interesting. What if all the other properties are stalled, but this one isn't? And it just, or maybe just put that in there as well. And then it grew from that, it's as sort of a contrast to the others and this sort of physical manifestation, concrete pun, concrete manifestation of Americanization and globalization.
And also it's such a great metaphor because, Trump did loom larger than just in the United States. Like we see this kind of Trumpist, either, kind of proto-fascism, political movements, nativism movements, and vicious capitalism spreading globally. And that also figures into your plot. I thought you really wove in the political situation very well and found characters to humanize that. There are people talking about, the anti-Muslim rhetoric of the government. And when I think of Trump, I think of, his xenophobia here in the United States. Were you intentionally thinking about that as a metaphor when you were putting this together?
You mean Trump Towers, right?
Yeah, like Trump Towers and the whole idea of xenophobia and this kind of nativist and this kind of xenophobic and racist in the context of America and I guess anti-Islamophobic in the context of India.
Honestly, at the time, I was thinking of the Indian political
Uh-huh.
situation in the government, and it's just unfortunate that there are so many parallels.
Uh,
But yeah, I mean, that sort of fundamentalism and nationalism and xenophobia is a phenomenon of our times, not just in America, not just in India, but across the world, right? So it's not a coincidence that those things happened and are happening at the same time. And of course, this novel, for those who don't know, is set over the summer of 2018, specifically just one summer. And so that was the time and that all of this was happening. And yeah, initially I just thought, well, I just focused on what's happening in the India that I was trying to write about, and this was one of the things that was important. But the fact that there is a parallel in America at the same time, I mean, the Trump as a political figure doesn't play a big part in the novel. It's really the capitalism, the brands, the buildings. It's an American. Oh, he's American, so it'll get ready on time. Don't worry. That's the sort of rhetoric, right? I think most of the investors are not even thinking of the politics. But I think readers can imbue their own political views quite easily and think about the parallels. And that's one of the interesting things about the book, writing the book for me, is that as I kept writing it, I realized how much we all have in common,
mhm.
despite all the differences, and how all of these are globalization has led to more xenophobia too, right? So yeah, those parallels definitely there.
Great, thank you. And as Paula mentioned, one of the unique features of your novel is that you have 10 different main characters. And you start with Manika coming back. She's the Indian expat. She's been teaching in the United States. She comes back to visit her widower father. But then meet her old high school friend and the husband and people of different classes, a masseuse, a caterer, a photographer, and each chapter shifts to that person's point of view. And I love that. It really was an unusual form for a novel, and I thought it just made it so rich. Can you talk about the writing process? Like, when did you decide? Did you always know you were going to write it that way?
No, not at all. At first, I just wanted to write a normal novel, something that would be easier. But I did think I might have two perspectives. It started out as a very different book. It was Manika and her mother, who past and present, Calcutta and Rishipur. That was the contrast I was going for. Old India, new India, And then I didn't really have a plot that was compelling enough for me, and I was sort of floundering. And then one day somebody asked me, can you summarize? I was having trouble, and I was talking to my writers group, and they really didn't like what I was writing. They were just, this is not going anywhere. You're just describing places, but there you don't have. And I didn't have Trump Towers yet because this was earlier. And they said, well, what about, how would you summarize what you want to do in one sentence? And so I remember writing out this very long sentence, and it basically said, I want to tell the story of this town that is impacted by globalization and different kinds of people and how their relationships and lives are changing. And then I realized that it's not really about one person,
Mhm.
it's really about a city and a community. And I started writing out. I already had the first chapter, which was kind of Manika's. Then I wrote Ramona, and I wrote one. I shouldn't disclose. I shouldn't reveal whose chapters come. But then I wrote the third one, and I thought, oh, this is kind of fun,
Mhm.
because it was much easier for me to do it that way. And I could just feel like the novel was unfolding. And over the next few years, what started happening is that they became less and less separate, like stories, and more chapters of a novel where things just started getting intertwined and echoing and foreshadowing, just ideas all over the place. So that was a longer process. But yeah, I think I think this story had to be told that way.
It certainly, I feel like it's just such a rich perspective, and I love that you told it this way. Since you mentioned these two characters, I'm going to ask you questions about Monica and her high school friend, and perhaps kind of a rival, Ramona. And at first, when we first introduced Ramona, Ramona is the perfect person, right? She's beautiful, she's wealthy, she's got the perfect marriage, she's the one who's going to have the flat in Trump Towers, she's the epitome of success. And when they were high school classmates, I couldn't say that they're really friends. Um, she had no time for Manika, right? Manika feels, and so she kind of becomes like a villain in the first chapter. She's kind of the mean girl. But then when we get into Ramona's head, we see a completely different perspective, and she becomes uh, a much deeper and more interesting character. Did you always know that you were going to kind of flip the perspective, or the reader's perspective of your characters when you switch into their point of view, or did that kind of organically form? How did you develop your characters?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always really interested in trying to understand what people are thinking behind the facades that we see. You know, I'm just really interested in that just as a person. And um I really like characters to be complex and nuanced and to kind of subvert our expectations. And of course, with this kind of structure, it became sort of evident that this was going to happen because we see them, you know, through their eyes. And no one really ever knows what's going on in someone else's head anyway. And also, I really didn't want Ramona to become this flat, you know, rich girl, rich, beautiful girl, either like a bored, rich, beautiful housewife or, you know, a victim of anything. I really wanted all the characters to be complex and to have complicated lives because that's more interesting. And in order to do that, I just had to. So some of it was, yes, let's flip it, because Manika sees Ramona a certain way, but Manika isn't perfect either. And, you know, Ramona sees her flaws. And this was really important to me because a lot of people are like, oh, wait, you must be Manika. This has to be an autobiographical. And I have a question for you later about this as well. But, you know, it's really not true because I really wanted her to become a character in her own right, where people can point to her and say, you know, these are the things you do, and you know, this is. And but as I was writing the different characters, of course, their stories grew and grew, and you know, things happened, and things happened to Ramona, which I didn't know would happen to her in the beginning. Other people, you know, do things which impact her life, which I didn't know in the beginning at all. So that's plot, right? That's also some of, you know, the characters were there, but then the plot started taking shape and that impacted the characters and vice versa.
All right, thank you. One other thing I noticed, and I mean, you have really also very interesting male characters, but there were more female characters, and the women were so complex, and they really did change depending on who was describing them and who was seeing them, and they also changed in surprising ways, and all exhibited interesting agency throughout. Just and unexpected to me as a reader. Nobody's storyline turned out the way that I expected. And I won't, without mentioning a name because I don't want to give away plot points, but like, there's a character who's a masseuse, and she's kind of subservient, and she's the, you know, the quiet one in the background that everyone trusts. And she becomes a very interesting person with a lot of agency. Did you like, how did you come up with her arc? Because I felt like she was just a really thrilling character to read about.
Yeah, this is actually a great question. First of all, there are 5 women and 5 men.
Oh,
So it's interesting that you said, maybe the women, like, they just seem more, you know, present, but there are 5 and 5, which was not intentional, but I realized later, oh, that's cool. There are 5 and 5. And I did want even the men to be really complex, you know, and nuanced. But of course, there's a lot of gender roles at play in this book and in this story. And especially, you know, it's interesting because sometimes you think that class and gender go hand in hand, and maybe the people who are poorer will have more, you know, in India, at least the stereotypes will see, which of course is true, that there is patriarchy that manifests itself more, you know, with less education and so on. But sometimes even very rich people can be very patriarchal, you know, and very traditional and very conservative. And so there's that interesting thing where most of the women are having to navigate this. Even Manika, who lives alone in America, right? Even she's not prepared for certain things, or she is not as independent as she thinks she is, and so on, right? So there's that subversion. Pinky's arc was, and I wanted to make sure that the poorer characters, the working class Indians, I didn't want them to just be victims, to just be oppressed and, you know, silent or mute. And, you know, I just didn't want those binaries. And I'm not saying that never happens in real life, but I think people are more complex than we usually see in portrayed. Pinky, it's interesting because until the very end, until my last draft, my chapters were ending a little bit differently. And I actually published Pinky's chapter as a short story called The Confidant in Ecotone magazine a few years ago. And that story ends that story ends, it's a story, it's a it's a standalone piece. And I think it ends beautifully, very poetically, but you don't really need to read on. And somebody even told me, one of my very early readers told me that these are more like link stories, and I had to decide what to do with that. I mean, I love link stories, but that's not what I was going for. So I really changed Pinky's ending. And it's very interesting when I see the short story and I see the chapter, and with the chapter, something's brewing, that you have to read on, and whatever happens in that chapter is now going to really impact the other characters and the chapters, whereas in the story you don't see those impacts because it ends. So yeah, I think that arc in particular had to be developed quite a lot.
It was, I agree that it's subversive. It subverts so many stereotypes. All of your characters subvert stereotypes. That was like, you see them, it's at the surface level first, and then by the middle and by the end, it's completely different from what the initial impression is, which is what's thrilling and so interesting about this book. One other place is so important in your novel. And one of the things I thought was interesting is kind of the role, this kind of this fictional Midwestern town where Manika is from, and she's teaching, and like from her point of view, it's so boring. And for people in India, they're like, oh, she is living the life. She's in America, she's a professor, she's so successful. And I like how like, that's not how she necessarily sees herself. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe like the idea of America or the idea of the Midwest becomes like almost a plot point or a character in your book?
Absolutely, yeah. So Heathersfield is very much, a contrast and to Rishipur, and it is a completely fictional town. Even though I live in the Midwest, I mean, I live in a mid-sized city, and this is a really small town, a college town. But the idea of America, it's interesting because just like we see India portrayed in maybe stereotypical ways, it's the same with the way America is portrayed. And I know you mentioned this in one of your stories about how the America that they knew were from movies, and everyone was beautiful and nobody was thinking about the taxes they had to pay and so on. And yeah, you don't think about the mundane things, but also America was typically glamorous and big cities and a lot of traffic and bright lights and tall buildings, something like New York or other big cities, very urban and cosmopolitan compared to India, at least traditionally, the way the two have been represented in comparison in literature and pop culture. And now when I go back to India, I haven't been back in 5 years, but pre-pandemic, when I was going back to India, I was going to cities and life there seemed, I wasn't startled by it like Manika is, but it's pretty cosmopolitan. And where I live is less so. It's all relative, and it is less so. And I mean, it's quieter, and you write a lot about the Midwest too. It's just different. It's just more subdued. And we were talking before this show began about how things are happening in the Midwest, like violent and tragic things. And so, of course, even that would be completely reductive, and there's a lot of complexity and richness. But the way that people normally perceive and think about another country is not based on very complex and nuanced, oh, it must be this, I mustn't think like this. No, they just go by what they see in pop culture. They just go by their imagination, what it's fed to them for years. And so they expect a certain kind of America. But not only is Manika aware that that's not where she lives, but when she starts to tell them about her life in Heathersfield, they're either shocked or disappointed.
Yes.
There's a point where Ramona is like, she rolls her eyes like, is there even a Bloomingdale's in Heathersfield? And someone is like, there's no cable TV. like she says, many of my friends don't watch cable TV. And it's like, how can Americans not watch cable TV? Like they invented cable TV. So it's, it's just,
I loved how like the characters in India, like they're recreating what they think America is. Like there's these giant shopping mall and they're making it like an American mall. And then the person from America, it's like it's nothing. It's nothing at all like the America that she's from.
yeah.
I thought that was a really clever twist.
Yeah, it was actually really fun. And yeah, I think there's one tiny mall. I mean, yeah, the first day she arrives and she asks her dad to give her a ride. She says, let's go check out I'm going to go check out the malls. And he's like, you
Uh-huh.
can't go. And she's
Uh-huh.
like, why not? And she gets really mad at him. And he's like, I have to take you, or someone has to drive you. And she's trying to tell him, I'm independent. I'm
Mhm.
35 years old, dad, And then he's like, you will get lost because there are 45 malls here. You won't know which one to go to. And she's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that because there's one mall at the end of one street called Main Street where I live, and you can't really get lost when you're going there. So it's just really interesting. I mean, it feels obvious in some ways, but it's so not obvious when you talk to people who live somewhere and they are like, they don't really expect what you tell them.
I think it's just I think it's very clever. I think it's very clever how you work in kind of America as a character that's constantly also shifting because we've got the Trump Towers, America, the rich, glitz, kind of gross, very gross, you know, global image of America and Trump as a representative. And then you've got the college town that nobody thinks about, the very quiet, sleepy, kind of rejecting that glitz version of America. And the same thing with your character, same way you portray India and all your characters in the book. That brings me to the title, because I thought the title was very nuanced as well. The dream builders, there's the dream, of course, you're thinking of the dream of becoming wealthy, this kind of the dream as we all kind of think of having a dream, American dream or an Indian dream of success. But there's also kind of idea of, I feel like there's also a fantasy, right? They're building in their heads this dream. It's not reality. Was that something you were consciously thinking about um, when you were writing and also when you were thinking of a title?
My title was totally different until like
Uh-huh.
3 months before I finished the book. It was actually Hiraeth, the Welsh word that means your stories remind me of that too. This longing or homesickness
Uh-huh.
and longing for home, a home that you can't go back to because it probably doesn't even exist. And then I thought, well, that was too esoteric and I didn't want people to have to look it up and it just didn't seem very catchy. And so I changed it to the Dream Builders at the last minute. It just came to me suddenly. And I thought, oh, that's cool because it's also the builders who are building Trump Towers, right? They're also the constructors, the actual builders who are like the ideal builders, basically, right? So yeah, so it just had all these different connotations, which was, which seem, but also, I mean, like what are the dreams really? Are they even worth having, or will people's dreams change by the end of the book? Or maybe their dreams have already come true and they were all overreaching for more. So it just felt like it had a lot of potential.
When you talk about like where their dreams come true or the overreaching, that was something I was also, I won't give away the plot, but I don't like it when novels set up like, oh, somebody's dreaming of success. And of course, those poor schlubs, they shouldn't want that. And so it's like kind of dooms them to failure and we're supposed to judge them. I really felt that you weren't judging your characters' dreams. You were just allowing your characters and just showing different people's different dreams. And it's not necessarily like, I don't know, like maybe the worst dreams are not the ones that are necessarily doomed to fail. You know what I mean? It's like I thought that was well done. And I appreciated that. I'll
Thank
just say
you.
that. It's not really a
Thank
question.
you. No, no. I actually, do you mind if I ask you a question? Because
Sure.
I love Tomorrow in Shanghai, by the way. It's so beautiful.
Thank
And
you.
I was reading your memoir, Harper Girl, and also the previous collection, Useful Phrases for Immigrants. And I was just wondering about something. I wonder about this a lot. So some of your, I mean, you can't really tell if the author is a first generation American or second generation, or if they emigrated, because all of the characters and stories, there are so many grandparents, people coming, people going back to China, people who've grown up here and feeling like neither Chinese nor, which by the way, I think I can really relate to in terms of my characters. Like Manika doesn't feel at home anywhere she goes. But do you feel like there's a difference between writing immigrant stories from, about people who've, just arrived versus people who've grown up here, the experiences, or how does that all come together?
I mean, I don't think I'm quite aware of it when I'm writing it. I just get into the head of the character and think, well, what would be this person's reality? But I'm aware of it when I'm like putting together a collection, because I really want to have, that's why I was interested about how you thought of the 10 voices, right? I don't want them all to be the same. And I don't want to like reinforce a stereotype. So I have to be very intentional when I'm putting the stories together, that I reflect those differences and those differences in perspective. That's why I was very intrigued to hear about how you thought about, also even just changing a short story to make it part of the novel and how that character's arc had to shift.
Yeah.
And I think I've changed short stories, like even though they're all short stories, and these collections you mentioned are not novels, I've changed some of the endings and tweaked some things so that it will flow better as a collection. Whereas when like a short story is published and it stands alone in a journal somewhere, it needs to just stop and it needs to be its own world. But as part of a collection, I want it to kind of flow with the ideas.
No,
There's
it's really beautiful. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you. And I also wanted to bring up, because this is, our topic is race in America. Just you live in the Midwest currently, you're in Michigan, and I think that sometimes we even in the United States, we have a lot of stereotypes about our own country and especially about the Midwest. And I think one of the stereotypes is that the Midwest is this quiet, bucolic, it's the heartland. We use that term in the United States constantly. Um, and I kind of often write to try to subvert that. And just a couple days ago, we had a horrible mass shooting in one of these quiet college towns. Like it could have been Monica's, town, and it had this horrible shooting. So were you thinking about that, kind of like these kind of stereotypes also about the Midwest when you were adding that thread to your novel?
Yes, definitely. I wish that I actually had a chapter set in Heathersfield from Mike's point of view, in an early draft, which I took out because I felt like it was disrupting the continuity and the flow. So it really couldn't be Heathersfield's story, but I had put it in there because I was so aware of the fact that I was maybe being reductive about the Midwest, or Manica, was being reductive about the Midwest. And so this chapter and someone else's point of view would have maybe addressed a little bit, made it more complex. But it's very important that Manica's own ideas about the Midwest shift a little bit, and other people sometimes have to point out to her, like Ashok has to point out things to her and tell her that maybe you're being reductive. And then there's also a line where she says that she hates it, she's bored, and then he says something negative, and he's like, and he waits for her to defend it, and immediately she does. So because it's true that places are very complex, and the reason I wrote this book is because I feel like India is not a monolith, right? It is so vast and so complex and so diverse in terms of experience that you cannot reduce it to one thing. You cannot say it's the story of, caste, or it's the story of arranged marriage or poverty, because they coexist with so many other things, which wax and wane, with time. But it's the same about America, which is part of the thing here, where America is not just New York. It's also other places. But then even within America, Rishipur itself is complex, and so is Heathersfield. So I hope that comes through. It's really important that it does. It didn't get the kind of space in the book physically, but I feel like it looms like in the imagination. I kind of wanted it to be like this imagined place where everybody projects their own things. Oh, I think it's beautiful and quiet and peaceful. I think it's really boring and dull. I think it's really racist and hostile. I wanted people to project their own things. It becomes this mythical thing because we don't really have a way of knowing usually, even when you live there for a very long time.
In some ways, because we don't get a chapter set in the American town, it actually becomes like more questionable, the reality. And I thought that comes across in your writing, because you've got such contrast of like everyone's notion of what America is. Even the character who lives in America, right? And it all is part of that dream that they're all building in their heads. And I feel like that comes through very much as a theme. There was some there was two really great questions in the chat I'm going to bring up. One was about Paula and like the languages, and like writing, what language informs your stories and text. One thing I wanted to point out that I thought was just so well done is that even though everything in the book is in English, you imply so many different kinds of Englishes. Like people will mention, oh, listen to their North Indian accent, or listen to this accent, and you talk about the different nuances. And I don't know any of these languages, but the way you wrote about it, I felt like I understood that these differences existed. So can you talk about like what is the difficulty of writing about in English about, India, which has all these different languages, including English?
Yeah, it's very difficult and very challenging and can be very problematic to be writing, especially working class characters' thoughts and speech in not only English, but idiomatic English, which they wouldn't be using at all. Like, at all. There's no way they would be thinking in English, these specific characters. But what do you do? Like the only solution to that is to write a multilingual novel where their chapters are in a different language. You can't even translate because even translation is, well, translating. So, I mean, and that's just not feasible, right? So I think the moment you write in English, if your character doesn't speak English or doesn't understand English and is thinking in English, there is a barrier and that's problematic. But I think what I did is I just tried to suspension of disbelief. They're thinking in English, but what would they be thinking? And what would they be smelling right now and hearing right now and thinking of and feeling? And I think that emotions don't have a language, right? However corny that sounds. So I was just trying to get as directly to the rawness of it. I really switched off from thinking that this is going to get published in America, hopefully, and Americans won't understand. I just wrote it the way I would write it to myself. And that's why someone just says, oh, she just, that North Indian accent grated on her nerves. It's Ramona. And I didn't think, will anybody know what I'm talking about? Because this is her in that moment and she's thinking this and I don't care if anybody gets it. That was that was the way I had to deal with it, and then of course I knew that hopefully an editor or someone would tell me, and they did, I mean, to some extent, like change, you cannot just say 40 degrees because people will assume it's Fahrenheit and you're talking about Celsius. And so we need to, somebody had once told me, maybe you need to convert it. And I'm like, I cannot convert it because she will be thinking it's 40 degrees. She will not be thinking it's, 100 degrees. There's just no way. That to me sounded false. And so I said, but we do often say it's 40 degrees Celsius. I remember telling my friends, hey, it's so hot today. It's, it's 37 degrees Celsius. You do add the unit. And so I added the unit and that, but I didn't convert it because it just felt. So even when people are speaking English, if something seemed really jarring or off to me, then I would change it, but because I still kind of think in Indian English a lot, I think I didn't have to translate for the characters. At least I could get to the thoughts more readily. If that makes sense.
The richness comes across on the page. So whatever you did and all the thought processes you put behind it, it really comes across, I feel, in the page. Another question is coming in is like, how challenging was it to write in the men's voice? I just want to say the men's characters, I'm sorry, my number was off, but they're some of the most tender characters. We get into their heads and we see like the tremendous burdens that they feel and the heaviness of that. And I thought that was really well done. How challenging was that to write those from those perspectives?
I didn't find it consciously challenging. And, I would love to hear what readers who identifies male tell me about how they, how it's working, or anyone, can tell me if it sounds off. But I actually really enjoyed writing those characters. And I've written male characters before in short stories, and I've really enjoyed it. Like, I don't find it, I would find it harder to write. I found it harder to write. I don't have kids, and I probably found it harder to write like Jessica's, about Jessica's life as a mom than I did about men. I don't know. It's just, I didn't find it hard to write about men. It's interesting what you do and do not, I didn't find it hard to write any of the working class characters. The one that was hardest for me to write was Manika. I think here's the thing. It's because I was making up stuff, it was so much easier. And when I was writing Manika, especially in the initial times, I was not able to make stuff up because it felt so filtered through my consciousness that it was like, because I just needed to be able to make stuff up, And so whenever I was doing that, I felt like it was very liberating and much easier.
That is fantastic advice. I sent this, I noticed at this event to my students. So there's some creative writing students out there listening. So can you talk a little bit about your process? Like, how long did it take to write this novel, and what was your revision process like?
I started sometime in 2016. I know that it was 2016 because I went to the Siwani Writers Conference and with my prologue in my first chapter. There's no prologue, but there was one at the time. And I had a prologue and I had a first chapter. But then over the next couple of years, I was writing that old version, like mother, daughter, whatever, and I wrote a lot. But in 2018, I was on sabbatical in India. I was like really working on this book. And towards the end of my sabbatical at the beginning of April, I threw everything away because it was not working. And so I just kept the first chapter. I threw everything, like 75 pages away. And then I started over around April 15th, 2018. It was Bengali New Year. So it was, and then I finished it. I finished my first complete draft in 2019. That too, I remember because I started revising it at VCCA. It's interesting how you have these milestones, And then over the next 2 years, I just revised it so many times. I thought I'd finished it in 2021, in about March. That's when I finally showed the whole novel to a couple of people. And they made some serious suggestions, like your chapters are not ending as chapters, but as stories, for instance. And so I made a lot of changes that summer. I would say it was done by the end of summer 2021. So a total of 5 years, but a lot of overhauling and throwing things away in the middle.
It feels to me very, very fast, frankly speaking. It feels like you really, 5 years for the density of this book, right? You have so many backstories of the characters, and they're interrelated and the stories are intertwined. It's a very complicated plot, actually. And even though the characters, like the perspective changes, the plot keeps moving forward with each chapter. And it's like I kept, racing through. I wanted to find out what was going to happen. It was so interesting. That I can't even imagine like how many revisions you have to do to get those intricate plot pieces to fit together. What was the thing can you point to a moment, like what was the thing that surprised you most about this process?
So I was in the beginning of my writing career, like many people who go through MFA programs and so on, and like to read literary fiction. My strength was not events and plot. Or maybe I shied away from it, What surprised me is how much happens in the book, how many events there are, like dramatic things. Someone wrote in a review that there's all kinds of things like blackmail and blah blah blah, all kind, and they all sounded very plotty, very exciting. And I think I was surprised at one point that this was happening in the book, that there were so many. But when there are so many people, and I don't know, it's just I think that was it was a nice surprise, of course. And the fact that the structure worked in the end, because I don't know, people would tell you don't do that, don't read. And I'm still surprised now when people say that it's working and I loved it. And I'm like, oh, because a lot of times I've heard that readers don't want to read multi-perspective novels, and they don't want to, and this is not even multi-perspective. They don't even rotate. They don't even come back. And the fact that it all worked as a novel in the end, it probably wasn't working like in 2018, but in the end, it feels perfectly like a novel going forward all the time. So the pacing, the arc, the structure, all of that working. So I guess, when you try something that seems new and ambitious and kind of experimental, you never really know what, if it's going to come out in a satisfying way. And I was very satisfied with it when I got done. Also, my editor at Tin House, Elizabeth DeMeo, of course, did, the last bit. We didn't do major editing, but we did talk about tightening things up. And that was a big help too. But I think, yeah. And of course, them loving the book and saying, we don't even need any major changes.
Oh.
I didn't even have an agent. And to hear that was very, very, I was surprised, honestly.
Well, I'm so happy that they, you found the right press, right? Because when you say people don't like who invented that, right? That's just some made up publishing rule. That's not true. Maybe they don't know how to market it, but I think readers will love this book. I think readers do love different perspectives. And it's so propulsive. It's exciting. And even though the perspective changes, the characters do reoccur throughout. So I hope anyone's listening, please buy the Dream Builders. It's a thrilling book, and I will not say anything more about the plot because I don't give it away, but it's very interesting and completely what I expected at the beginning was completely flipped by the end.
That's good. And since it's race in America, I just want to say that these stories, I hope, and your books as well, because I was just reading your stories this weekend and thinking, oh, wow, there's so much that resonates with me, I just think these are important stories, to tell, to read. And I do think people actually want to read them. They want to hear
Yes.
them. So I hope that there are more people out there who want to write and are encouraged to write their stories.
And I think people are hungry for these types of narratives with very real feeling characters. I felt like every one of these characters seemed like I could believe that they were real and they're not stereotypical, right? I think we're all really tired of what maybe the publishing industry has pushed on us, which is that binary, either it's like, oh, exotic India, or it's like it's only tech rich people India, right? And this is very complex, and it's the characters as individuals that were just so interesting and surprising.
Excellent, both of you. And you've got me thinking of a couple questions. I will try to narrow that down to one because we're talking about language and culture and how that informs writing, especially I think for Black writers and writers of color. I have done lots of hosting and interviewing of Black and brown authors, immigrants, first generation. And one of the things I consistently hear is that for a lot of them, especially with major publishers, and maybe depending on when they presented, they tend to have an issue, like when they try to inject something that's very specific to their culture, or even interject the language within the context of an American or an English novel, and where they've had to really kind of fight for, no, I want this particular sentence or word in Spanish or whatever. And I'm just wondering, for both of you, have you ever run into that where you had to really fight for that? And then kind of secondary to that, just for you as a writer, or let me put it this way, Toni Morrison unabashedly said that she wrote for and by Black people. Now, we all know that many more than just Black people appreciated and read Toni Morrison, but her point was taken. In other words, she didn't care what publishers thought, editors thought. She was fine with her characters being who they were, the audience potentially being an all Black audience. And I'm wondering, even today, do you find that you run into things like that as far as working with publishers of audiences that may not be Black and brown, or do you just write?
Well, I know of Toni Morrison. I mean, there were interviews, 'cause they're archived online, in which people just said, like, I think it was Dick Cavett said to her, "Well, when are you going to start write? Why are you going to write about white people?" As though it wasn't really literature until she did that. And it's shocking to hear that today, but it was a constant refrain that she had to fight against. And I think one of the, one of the many, many, many blessings that Toni Morrison has done for American literature and world literature is that she fought those battles so that people are a little bit more embarrassed to say that in the present day. Um, and so they don't have to, but there's still, like, I have heard the horror stories in which, there will be editors or agents or people out there who will say, you really need to have a white American character to be, to explain things, right? And I think that that's really false. I think that's really selling readers short.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is my debut novel, so, I have a lot less experience with publishers than you do. But I mean, of course, I've heard people say that about, other authors, friends, and editors of journals. I've been submitting my work, short stories, for years. And I just feel like what's most important is getting readers immersed in the story, right? Somehow you have to get them immersed. And too much explaining is not going to do it, and othering is not going to do it either. I feel like there are just readers are smart and smarter than people assume. And I think that they are actually hungry for a variety of new stories. But it comes down to marketing, and it comes down to promotion and to talking about work, in such a way as to get it on people's radar. But the more it happens, the more it's going to work. I can't really talk about, the publishing angle because, of what sells and what doesn't, and people maybe they have a reason for saying what they do. But I cannot possibly write. I can't also write just for an Indian audience, because even an Indian audience is so wide and complicated that most of them are not going to even read my book. So which then I would be writing just for a very elite urban Indian, English speaking Indian audience, or maybe a South Asian immigrant audience. And those are all, I mean, that's just not why you write. I mean, you hope that your work is going to resonate with everybody. And I don't think that people just read about themselves and their own experiences, right? I mean, I just don't think people, why do they even read fantasy? Like my students, only read about vampires and cyborgs, and they're not even reading about themselves at all. So I know that sounds like a very facetious comment, but really, I think people want to be immersed and entertained, even if it's by tragedy or whatever, right? But and I just think that it's really important to tell the authentic story, whatever is authentic to you, right? And I know a lot of writers still maybe cling to stereotypes because that's really what they experience or believe, not just cynically, to sell their books. That's the worldview. And that's interesting to me, because maybe just have more worldviews out there so we can all complement each other a little bit more.
I think that's amazing. And I think that's absolutely 100% true. And I think more and more, whether it's corporate, the corporate world dictating what the market wants, but I think more and more reader audiences we see in film now, they're realizing, oh my gosh, there's, Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians and different, and not just those big blockbusters, but even smaller films that come from different countries and different languages, and that people, it resonates with people because I think, Oindrila, as you pointed out, it's about authenticity and speaking from your heart, writing from your heart. You're going to capture an audience, and you certainly have with the Dream Builders and Maylee, all your books. I'm such a fan. Thank you both so much for doing this. I do want to encourage our audience to definitely buy both these authors' books. But take advantage of Book Passage. I believe we do have first edition copies of the Dream Builders, and you can buy our books online. You can come in person to 2 different store locations, San Francisco and Corte Madera, or if you're in a different part of the country or the world, but you want to support Book Passage and these authors, give us a call, go online or tap that link right below where you're watching now. And you can get your books. And we so appreciate you supporting these events. And specifically, I want to thank everybody, including all my guests this week, for supporting the Race in America mini series event. I think that these are the type of stories we want to hear. These are the conversations we want to have, and we want everybody to hear them. Thank you to my two authors for doing this. Mei Li, once again, being a part of one of my panels. I love you. Oh, and much success, Oindrila, for this book. Thank you very much. Until next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you.